So, first of all, I would tell you that in the whole entire field of scientific studies and publications, there is no field that has been most corrupted and had the poorest quality research published than antidepressants in all of medicine. And this is well known. Like if you talk to researchers, they pretty much know if you want a bad example of research is done, if you want to see how the pharmaceutical industry has had a huge influence on getting data published, it's antidepressants. It's like way up here and nothing else is even close. Okay, so that's what you have to understand. Now, before we get into antidepressant research, I want to show you a study that was published where it was titled Placebo-Activated Neural Systems Are Linked to Antidepressant Responses. And what they did is they did a 2-week crossover trial where they wanted to see what would happen to the brain giving a placebo. So they did PET scans of the brain before and after and giving antidepressants. And then when they were done, what they looked at, was there a really big difference between taking an antidepressant or taking a placebo? And they found out that the placebo effect was really accounting for a significant impact of the outcomes. So they go on to put in the conclusion of their study, placebo-induced endogenous opioid release in the regions was associated with better antidepressant treatment response, meaning that when they looked at the brain, people thought they were taking something, placebo effect, their brain lit up, their opioid receptor system lit up, and it was actually more effective in the study than the antidepressant. And then they go on to show that predicting 43% of the variance in symptoms improvement at the end of the antidepressant trial. So here you can see the scans that they're using, and here they're using that basic antidepressant drug. You can see some areas of activity, and they look at the severity of it over time, and the less activity they see in the opioid system, the more severe depression is. And then look at the outcomes before and after placebo and antidepressants. And here with the placebo group, the opioid response is actually much, much greater and much more effective. So this goes on to show that just the placebo effect is going to have some response with almost 50% of the population. So when someone does something that's totally ridiculous, like a urinary neurotransmitter test to see what's happening in the brain, which it does not determine what's happening in the brain, those are peripheral urine levels, and then tries to develop some kind of nutraceutical or amino acid blend to help that. And then they give it to people and go, hey, as a clinician, I see that helps some people. That's because a large part of what just happens in general is a placebo effect. And what's going to be the outcome with them, not in the first initial placebo effect response, which will last a few weeks, but a month later or 2 months later or 3 months later. So you should always suspect a placebo effect with anything you give someone with a mood disorder. And most diagnostic factor that it could have been a placebo effect, that it doesn't hold its effect as time goes on, which you also see with many different types of treatment variables. Okay. Now, this was a paper that was published in 2018, and it went through all the different major studies published in the field of antidepressants. And they go on to say that recent studies not only may overestimate the effect of antidepressants, but also may exaggerate placebo response because of various biases. Sponsorship and publication biases have been one of the targets of criticism in the ethical debate. And they go on to say in this paper, which you should definitely read, the various biases they have. So first thing we have is selection bias. So with these clinical trials that have been done with antidepressants, their exclusion and inclusion criteria, or that first of all, they can't have any other type of mood disorder. Just so you know, 64% of people that have anxiety have depression also have anxiety. So they would be excluded. If they have any other diseases like diabetes or any kind of medical condition, they're excluded. If they have severe depression or moderate depression, they're excluded. If they have alcohol abuse or substance abuse, they're excluded. And they go on to say that this is absolutely not generalizable to the population that seek antidepressants. The people that actually seek antidepressants have multiple mood disorders, other comorbid diseases, they have substance abuse, they have alcohol abuse, and they're probably only getting about a 20% reflection of what's actually the population of patients that real clinicians see in practice versus what's been artificially created in clinical trial. So that's a major issue of many of the clinical trials, majority of the clinical trials published on antidepressants. And then we also have some biases where not all the studies are double-blind or placebo-controlled, or some are single-blinded. And these have a huge impact on outcomes. And then the statistical analysis that's used, and I'll go over some of that in a couple slides here, that are used to determine these outcomes or severely biased and flawed. And then most importantly here, publication bias. So let's go about publication bias, because this is the biggest factor. Now, when you look at the data, so if you were a physician, if you're a researcher, and you wanted to look at antidepressants, do they work, do they not work? You go to the literature and see what the randomized clinical trials show. And if you look at the trials that were done and approved by the FDA, there were 74 clinical trials done for antidepressants, okay? 38 of them had a positive result, meaning they found some benefit taking the antidepressant. And you should remember, these are only for 8 weeks, 16 weeks. These are not long-term. But 36, almost half, showed no effect. And that's okay. That's fine. But this is where the publication bias comes in. Only 3% of negative trials were published, okay? And 44 positive trials were published. This is just how studies are sometimes rehacked with secondary outcomes and other variables, so you can get more studies published out of them. So you have 44 positive trials and 3 negative. Now, why does other negative studies not get published? Because the study is negative, so the pharmaceutical companies that ran these trials decided not to publish. So now you look at the highest level of evidence, which is to do a meta-analysis. Take a list of all the studies published on do antidepressants work, and you have 44 studies that say it does work, and 30 that says it doesn't work. So you got a problem. Now you have this, the data clearly shows antidepressants work. But in reality, if you look at almost half of them not working and only 30% working, this would probably just null itself out in a meta-analysis and show that there's really no effect. Now, some researchers have then gone further and looked at how they determined primary endpoints and outcomes in these studies. They took the same data, but looked at the analysis. And when you look at clinical trials, there's a primary endpoint, and then there's different ways that they follow through and look at attrition rates and how many people finish the study. And if the dropout rate is different in one group or another, you can have effects that are completely different. So they were doing these methods where they were looking at a method where the last outcome is carried forward versus per protocol attention to treat type variations that were used. And they found that when they actually did a proper analysis, they actually found no difference in some of these studies that were published to support drugs that are being approved by the FDA. And overall, they show this intimate relationship between how clinicians and funding and this trend to have only researchers that can find a positive impact keep getting grants and funds versus those that don't. And the study design variations that were done seem to be getting all the funding and all the support. And it really is a big problem. They also found many things that were very interesting, like when they looked at questionnaire forms and how things were done, how they could look at the mean outcomes. For example, if they do a baseline mean of a Hamilton depression score, they say the actual score is 23, but the first time you do it, you don't really understand the question, so you rate higher. And what should be done is you do it over again 2 or 3 times, then you get the actual mean. So if you did a questionnaire form once, it's most likely going to be scored higher, unless you did it 2 or 3 more times and really understood the questions, and then your mean would probably be accurate. So these studies intentionally just do one baseline. They don't get the true mean by doing multiple testing. And then, of course, the outcome is much, much greater. So it's known in the field of antidepressant research as a lot of misleading results. So they disregard trials with negative results. They use multiple selective favorable results. They conduct subgroup analysis, select favorable results, people that don't have any other comorbidities, any other diseases. They alter parametric results to non-parametric forms and vice versa. This is a statistical analysis method. They choose inferior drugs when they do superiority and inferiority studies. And for example, they use higher doses of a competitor's drug for tolerability on a safety trial compared to the new trial. And they may use lower doses for an efficacy trial when they compare one drug versus another. And all this is done is just to get the drug approved so they can make claims for it with the FDA and so forth. So scientists, research scientists, data analysis scientists that look at antidepressants really have found conclusively now in the literature that this data is really not that great, that there isn't really a big effect with antidepressants, and that the effects that have been found are completely overemphasized, and this is very misleading to people. Now, recently in 2022, a group of data analysis researchers looked at, okay, we know this is a problem. We published on these factors, and other scientists have published on these factors, how these clinical trials were done and the data outcomes were much greater than they really were, have things really changed? So if we look at clinical trials done recently in the past few years, and we look at the meta-analysis of newer studies, which are the older studies that were severely flawed, which still is the reason why we have these antidepressants approved, they're much changed. So they go on to say that in earlier studies, using the Food and Drug Administration review documents as a gold standard, found that many negative trials had been misreported in the published literature as having positive outcomes or had simply not been published. And they go on to look into, since then, reporting bias has been the subject of additional studies and policy changes, raising the question, is the antidepressant literature now being reported more transparently? Because it is very clear that it was not. Okay. Conclusion, reporting bias remains a significant impediment to researchers and medical decision makers, so further efforts are needed to improve transparent reporting in scientific literature. And basically what they found is when they looked at the trials, older trials versus looking at newer drugs, that they have improved. These were negative trials in the past, and now they can see that the slant is not as bad, but it's still there. But it's definitely a huge difference than what it was. And most of the drugs that have received approval, most of the mindset that's infiltrated psychiatry and medicine is that these antidepressants are very effective, and if you take them, they should work. And that's really not what the data really showed with these clinical trials when they were critically analyzed. So that then leaves us to, okay, do they work, do they not work? Well, the bigger question is, what happens to them long term? Because we know that a placebo effect has but a 43%, almost 50% effect on people randomly when they take something for their mood disorder. The bigger issue is, what about long-term effects? And I think, as most of you already know, working with patients, most people say, yeah, I tried Prozac or Wellbutrin or some Zoloft and it seemed to work for a little bit and then stopped working. But they've been on it for now a year and they can't just titrate off. So now they're stuck on it for years and years, and is there any really effect? And one large study was published here. There's two large studies that were published, but this was a study that was published and they went through the literature really asking the question, how effective are antidepressants for depression over long term? Because remember, these clinical trials that are done to get drug approval are done for 12 weeks, 8 weeks, 16 weeks. They're not long-term. And then they go, summary conclusion. Currently, there is no reliable evidence that long-term antidepressant treatment is beneficial. And there are legitimate concerns that it may be largely ineffective or even harmful in a substantial portion of users. And then this was followed by a recent study that was done in 2022, which looked at 17 million sample size over a 2-year period. And what they found was the real-world effect of using antidepressant medications does not continue to improve patients' health-related quality of life over time. Further studies should not only focus on short-term efficacy of pharmacotherapy, they should rather investigate the long-term effects of pharmacological and non-pharmacological interventions on these patients' health-related quality of life. So they don't work long-term.